Good evening. On behalf of the Hispanic Student Caucus and the Board of Editors of the Journal of Hispanic Policy, I would like to welcome you all to tonight's forum event. Tonight's debate coincides with the release of the 1987 issue of the Journal of Hispanic Policy, a nonpartisan publication of the Kennedy School Hispanic Student Caucus. Its fundamental aim is to serve as a forum for meaningful discussion and debate of policy questions affecting the U.S. Hispanic community. Tonight's discussion on U.S. immigration policy is an attempt to bring what the Journal attempts to accomplish on paper to a live setting. And tonight we believe we have two excellent and informed speakers who will do just that. Here with us this evening to introduce them is Dean of the Kennedy School, Graham Allison. Dean Allison.
It's a great pleasure for me to be part of this launching of the Journal of Hispanic Policy, and the students who put it together and made it happen deserve our hearty congratulations. So I want to congratulate Adolph and the others who've worked so hard on this. I'm especially honored to be able to be part of this and to welcome to the John F. Kennedy School of Government tonight Senator Alan Simpson, Congressman Bill Richardson, and Professor Deborah Anker. Because the U.S. is a nation of immigrants, few policy issues are as controversial as immigration reform. On the one hand, we confront a question: can a nation survive without borders and procedures for distinguishing citizens from others? On the other hand, immigration policy obviously affects our perception of who we are and what kind of country we want to be. In the words of Senator Simpson, it is an issue filled with guilt, fear, and anger. Last October, after 5 years of debate and compromise, Congress passed the first immigration reform law in 21 years. The Simpson-Rodino bill provides amnesty for aliens who prove that they've lived in the U.S. since 1982, and for agricultural workers who were employed for at least 90 days in the last year. As a result, up to 4 million aliens and their relatives may become legal citizens. The bill also gives states $4 billion to defray increased costs for social services and schools, and close to $1 billion to expand the Border Patrol 50%. Employers can now be jailed or fined up to $10,000 for each illegal alien they knowingly hire. While the New York Times applauded the bill as a great achievement, critics doubt that the law is fair or workable. As one immigrant told a reporter, quote, "If the choice is to go without food or cross, we'll cross," close quote. The man who kept the immigration bill alive through 3 Congresses is Senator Republican Whip Alan Simpson. His initiative and stick-to-itiveness in pursuing this issue to resolution is a legislative profile in courage. The son of a former governor and senator, Alan is a native of Wyoming who earned his BS in 1954 and his JD in 1958 from the University of Wyoming. In 1964, he was elected to the Wyoming House of Representatives, where he became the majority floor leader, and in 1978 was elected to the U.S. Senate. He is now chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Subcommittee of the Environment and Public Affairs Committee, chairman of the Immigration and Refugee Policy Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee, and a member of the Veterans Affairs Committee. According to colleague Slade Gordon, Alan is the most popular man in the Senate, largely because of his unfailing fairness, his steady good sense, and his dry humor. He has been heard to proudly proclaim that there are more cows than people in Wyoming, quote, "because we prefer them," close quote. When teased about his baldness, he will explain that a man is born with just a fixed amount of male hormone and that he wouldn't want to waste any by growing hair. A leading critic of the Simpson-Rodino bill is Democratic Congressman Bill Richardson. Bill was born in Pasadena, California, and grew up in Mexico City. He earned his BA from Tufts in 1970 and his MA from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in 1971. He worked for the State Department and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee before moving to New Mexico to become the executive director of the Democratic State Committee. In 1982, he was elected to the House of is 3/5 Hispanic and Native American. He serves on the Energy and Commerce, Interior, Education, Labor, Telecommunications, and Selecting Aging Committees, among others, and specializes in natural gas deregulation, immigration, and foreign policy. After only 4 years in Congress, he was chosen to be an assistant Democratic whip. He's traveled to Latin America to meet various heads of states, written an article for Foreign Policy magazine, and won the chairmanship of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. His hometown newspaper, the Santa Fe Reporter, commented, quote, "What seems noteworthy about Richardson's legislative record is less its partisan consistency than the sheer volume and success," close quote. Any new law, of course, means more lawyers, and tonight we have one with us as our moderator. Professor Deborah Anker earned her BA in History from Brandeis in '69, her Master's from Harvard in 1970, and her JD from Northeastern in 1975, as well as a Master's of Law from Harvard in 1984. She was an associate for 3 years with a firm here in Boston and an attorney for 5 years at the International Institute of Boston. Since 1984, she's been a lecturer on immigration and asylum law and a clinical field work instructor at Harvard Law School. We're fortunate to have such an illustrious panel for this debate tonight, and very pleased to welcome Professor Anker, Senator Simpson, and Congressman Richardson. Please join me in saying welcome.
The format we're going to have this evening is each of the debaters is going to speak for 15 minutes. I will then pose one question to each of them, which the other individual will be able to respond to, and then we'll open it up to you. You want to begin, Senator Simpson?
I will, but I'm going to uncoil first. And then I'll come back and sit over there, I promise. Deborah, thank you, and Graham, thank you. It's a special privilege to be here. It's not my first time at this remarkable forum, and it is a special honor to be here on each and every occasion. And especially to share the evening with Bill Richardson, who I've come to have the greatest respect and admiration for. For when the bill died in conference committee, the previous time before the final passage, 2 years before, he said, "You know, that's very disappointing to me. I'm saddened by that. We have to do something. And can we just talk about it?" And I went over to see him. I said, "Yeah, I admire you greatly because, you know, you are part of the Hispanic caucus. It's a tough issue for you." And he said, "Yes, but we have the nation's business to do." So Bill and I actually worked on a bill which is somewhere in the spools of the computer. Damn good bill, too, down in there. And it is. And someday pieces of it will come to pass as we do our oversight, perhaps. And it's very serious business that we have in front of us with the oversight. Well, that was a marvelous introduction, just about the way we went over it. God, you're all asleep out there. But I heard him announce that my father was governor, and I want to tell you he was governor of Wyoming, and he had a great story, and he loved to tell it. I'm watching my time. And it was this old cowboy going down country road. He had the pickup. He had everything in the back of that pickup. It's in the 1930s. This highway patrolman stopped him. He said, "Going a little fast there, aren't you, cowboy?" He said, "No, didn't think I was." "Yeah, he said you were." He said, "You're speeding." He said, "No, didn't think I was." He said, "Well, you were." He said, "Haven't you got a governor on that truck?" He said, "Nope." He said, "That's manure you smell." Those of you that are too young to remember what a governor on a truck is will have a little trouble with that. Well, I could share one quick Wyoming story with you. This couple hit the sack. Phone rings at 3 in the morning. Guy answers and says, "How the hell do I know? That's 2,000 miles from here." Hangs up, and his wife said, "Who was it?" He said, "I don't know. Some nut called and asked if the coast was clear." I can see that you came here for serious business tonight. And so did I. Because this is an issue that is filled, you left out part of it, it's filled with emotion, fear, guilt, and racism. And every time I would have a hearing and it would degenerate into that, I'd say, just leave the room. We've got some important business to do, without dragging that into the situation. And so we worked very hard over many years. My ranking minority member was Ted Kennedy. I was chairman of the committee. Ted was the ranking Democrat. We've switched roles now. Ted is the chairman, and I am the ranking Republican. It's a ghastly thing that happened in November. And instead of being majority whip, I'm the minority whip. Power's ebbing through my fingers on a daily basis. Anyway, I was put on the Select Commission by Jimmy Carter, President Carter. I said, I don't want on that. It's not an interest of mine, and I would prefer to be removed from that. And Howard Baker said, no, you're going to serve on the Select Commission. So the 4 senators were myself, Ted Kennedy, Mac Mathias, and Dennis DeConcini. And that was in 1979. And so I decided to get wet all over, and I did. So we have this bill, and it is a sweeping piece of legislation. And the interesting thing is that people are just beginning to pay attention to it. And it is one that commands high drama. Already in some of the remarks, you know, when you talk about employers getting jailed, that kind of stimulates the glands. And yet that's the last alternative under the bill. First is a civil penalty of $200 to $1,000, then $1,000 to $4, I think, and then to $5, and then $10, and then finally a cease and desist order can be obtained, and under those circumstances perhaps jail. But that's the last. And then the toughest part for me throughout, and the tough one for the American public, please remember, if you can, that we're not talking about legal immigration. We're not talking about our national heritage, our treasure of ethnic mix and seed immigrants. That's not what we're talking about. And we're not talking about refugees. Hear it? Keep that totally out of this debate. Nothing about refugees, nothing about sanctuary. That's refugees. Asylum, now I'm ready to debate those, you bet. I'll jump in and hop around in that all you want. But the problem is that the people of America don't make a distinction between an immigrant and a refugee and an extended voluntary departee and a permanent resident alien and a Cuban Haitian entrant. They think that an immigrant, for heaven's sakes, is somebody that got off the boat at Marielito and is hacking their way toward New York with a blunt instrument. That they came from Mariel Harbor. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about illegal, undocumented people, human beings, each and every one, who come here for one reason and one reason alone, and that is to work. They are not refugees. A refugee is a person fleeing persecution or with a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, national origin, or membership in a political organization or political opinion. That's a refugee. So that will be helpful if we can keep that. One of the things that we're going to be talking about is whether we have or will have discrimination under this bill. And will that be an economic and social consequence of the bill? And how about U.S.-Mexican cooperation to reduce the push-pull factors of illegal Mexican migration? Well, that's one of the things we tried awfully hard to handle in the bill, and that's discrimination. A large majority of the Congress supported employer sanctions. That's a great number. Some feared that discrimination could result against potential employees who, quote, look or sound foreign, unquote. The bill was drafted particularly in order that employer sanctions would be inherently non-discriminatory, and this means no new discrimination, at least, arising solely from employer sanctions. That's what we tried to prevent. And the bill has some strong teeth in there to do just that. Some say that because they fear the penalties, they won't hire. I'm sure that there is some firing going on right now in the land with regard to employers. That's a tragedy. There's nothing in this bill that requires anybody to fire anybody right now. So if they're doing that, that's a miserable excuse for an employer, because that is not required. And so then we require, what is it we require of the employer? We require him to examine documents. And the regulations come out today. How interesting that you should be here on the day that the regulations will come out. There has been a draft regulation, and now you're going to see the final version of the regulations as of today, telling you what documents will be presented and asked for. And this is the key. The documents will be asked for, and the employer is not responsible as to whether they are phony or improper. His only function is to ask and check the box on a form that says, I have asked this person for the following documents and received, and he presented this. And that ritual is performed by the employer not just with people who look or sound foreign, but by bald, skinny Anglos like me too. Or else you would have true discrimination, unless it is across the board. So that is something I wanted to share. Someone says, well, wait till we get to legalization. There will be a cottage industry in forged documents. I can tell you right now there is a cottage industry in forged documents. Within a mile of this building, you can pick up any documents you wish. Passports, green cards, transportation documents, you name it. So let's at least deal honestly with that issue. How are we doing on time? You're watching me like a hawk. I can feel your presence out of there. Okay, that's very important that we remember. But in this bill, for the first time, we have heavy penalties, felonies against those who use or forge or manipulate documents. We've never had that before. And remember, one of the other parts of this exercise is that the employee who is seeking employment, new hire employment, and remember this, please, anyone that is presently hired before November 6th of 1986 is not included or covered under this bill. They're just there. It's only new hire after that date that are involved here. And the employee, for the first time, has to sign a statement that he's authorized, he or she are authorized to work in the United States. Under penalty of perjury, they make this statement. We've never had that before. And then in that situation, that's a serious offense that is known to people, that, and it says it will say it in several languages, that is a felony if you purge yourself. And it doesn't say you're a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident alien or some kind of adjusted status. It just says you're authorized to work in the United States of America. Okay, we'll get into a lot of that this evening. Just swiftly then, and I'll conclude, people always ask me about Mexico and our relationship with Mexico, and how could we possibly have done this in a unilateral basis without considering the conditions in Mexico and the government of Mexico. Well, I have visited with President Lopez Portillo and President de la Madrid and Bernardo Sepulveda and people all throughout the Mexican government, and especially I remember a visit with President Lopez Portillo, and I said, there's nobody in this room but us chickens. What in your heart of heart would you have us do in the United States of America if you were to have, as you see us doing what we're doing? This was 6 years ago. Well, he said, I wouldn't interfere a bit with that. You're a sovereign nation. We would be offended if you told us what to do about our laws. And so we have nothing to say to you about that. I said, I know, but that doesn't answer the question. What would you like to see us do? And he said, well, that is, I would like to see you take care of our people and see that they're treated fairly and kindly and humanely. And I said, how do we do that when they're there illegally? And he said, that is the issue, isn't it? I said, in my mind, that is the only issue. So that's where we are. We have a commission in the bill. It was Senator Simon's proposal. We adopted it. A study commission to examine programs of economic cooperation between the United States and Mexico. Economic development initiatives are no substitute for our own opportunity to do something as a sovereign nation. And during the second debate, the Mexican Senate sent us a wire that said, we think you're making a terrible mistake, you cannot do this unilaterally, and we object, in a sense, is what they shared with us. And that was signed by members of the Mexican Senate, including former Ambassador Hugo Marguén. And my response to that was that if we had done that to the Senate of Mexico, we'd be digging out of the backwash of that yet. And we don't intrude on Mexico as they're dealing right now with serious problems on their southern border. Refugees from Guatemala that they don't want. And in that country they have an identification system which makes ours pale in process. So as we get into Mexican-U.S. relations, let's remember what is going on in Mexico. There are only two countries in the developed world that have no control over their borders, and that's the United States of America and the United States of Mexico. And they're trying desperately to get theirs under control, and we've made our step. Well, that's some of the things that those are some of the things that you will hear tonight. It will be a great pleasure. The Select Commission dealt with discrimination and Mexico-U.S. relations for so many years. And then I want to be sure I don't cross the line between good humor and smart aleck. But I always said to people throughout the entire debate, if you don't like what we're doing, then give us an alternative, but no fair quoting from the Statue of Liberty. Because the statute doesn't say, in the words of Emma Lazarus, send us everybody you've got, legally or illegally. And if the issue is simply, are we going to have a country that is so dependent upon illegal, undocumented people to do its work for it, then let's find that out quick, because we fought a war about that about 120 years ago. It's called slavery. Now those are your issues. Those are some of the things we'll be pumping around in tonight, and it will be a spirited discussion because it always is. And thank you very much, Deborah, Bill. Thank you.
I'd first like to commend the Center and the caucus and the Hispanics from Harvard that make me proud, because as a Hispanic, I feel proud that in one of our most distinguished institutions, you're doing something about public policy. But you know, Alan, you mentioned early on, you started with a humorous anecdote. I can't resist doing the same. It won't be as funny as yours. I have difficulty in explaining to people how a guy named Richardson is Hispanic. Now, I come from a district in New Mexico that's 40% Hispanic, 40% Anglo, and 20% Native American. I have the largest Native American district in the country, Navajos. The way I get elected, I get the Anglo vote by using the name Richardson and not showing my face. Get the Hispanic vote, hablando tantito español y ahí viene mi mamá. And I get the Indian vote because I look like an Indian, right? So to come to Harvard and to talk to you with Alan Simpson is a privilege for me. I will try to give my talk and divide it up into three parts. First, why I think the piece of legislation that was carefully and positively crafted by somebody like Alan Simpson and others, with problems and misgivings, is now in danger of being disrupted by the bureaucracy. That's my first point. I'm going to deal with employer sanctions, legalization, guest worker provision. Ironically, Alan mentioned that the INS today released their, it's called regs, regulations. How are we going to implement the Simpson-Rodino law? This is where I'm concerned, and this is where the task ahead lies. The second point is, given those problems, given those concerns in those areas, what do we do about it? And then the third issue that I'd like to deal with is the future of our immigration laws. Alan touched on it. Our relationship with Mexico, which accounts for 68% of the problem. 68% of the illegal immigration comes from Mexico. 5,000 per day. 160,000 per year, Mexican nationals. So what do we do? Many of us tried for years and years to find that alternative. The best alternative was saying, let's deal with the pull and push factor. Let's have a relationship with Mexico that has economic development, border cooperation. We work with them to help stem this problem. But it didn't work for two reasons. The United States, our policymakers were oriented towards the Middle East, towards Europe, towards NATO, towards the Soviets. Latin America at our doorstep, Mexico at a doorstep. Not important. Push it back. And secondly, the Mexican government. They saw it as our problem. They refused to deal with it. They hoped it would go away. And after the bill passed, and after many of us had bills for border cooperation, they said, now we got a problem. So that was the realistic alternative that I think would have worked. But then if we're going to have an immigration bill, we've got to deal with two factors: employer sanctions and legalization. How do we make those two work without an employer sanctions causing discrimination, not just to the illegal alien, but to the Hispanic, to the, quote, foreign-looking person? How do we ensure that discrimination protection works? And how do we also have a generous legalization program in the traditions of this country? We're talking about 7 to 9 million of those undocumented workers in this country now. The INS estimates that it's 3.9 million that are going to rush to these document centers on May 5th to try to become part of the American mainstream and try to come out of the shadows. Alan Simpson has said the greatest gift of them all is to come out of those shadows for those 4 to 8 to 10 million that are here, that have lived here, that have participated in this country, and now deserve a chance. So where are we today with the regulations? And I am formally stating that as a result of INS regulations that I have seen today, that the administration, and I don't mean Alan Simpson, I am talking about the White House and the Department of Justice and the INS, is subverting the spirit of the law. Specifically, I am talking about huge budget cuts, failing to implement the law. I am talking about putting the burden on the undocumented worker for the financing of this program. I am talking about increasing discrimination of the Hispanic, of the foreign-looking person, as we implement this law. I am talking about the guest worker provision, a carefully constructed compromise that was not a bracero program, that was not a program that would all of a sudden have just a bunch of growers bringing in cheap labor, but a plan that was endorsed by the farm workers, by growers, by many, a very fragile compromise because of the definitions of the regulations that the INS has imposed may not work. I'm going to be specific today as we look at this act, which I think well-intended. We should have done it, but now we've got serious problems. And unless those problems are resolved, we could have a serious national crisis on our hands. Budget. The Act authorizes $422 million in fiscal year 87, $419 for fiscal year 88. The administration request for 87 was $138 million. and 194 for fiscal year 88. They want to starve this program to death. And that's wrong, because the intent of Congress was for this to be fully funded within the budget resolution, which it was, within Graham-Rudman, which it was. How can you have a program that costs outreach and education and staff to do this work? You can't just blame the INS for everything. You've got to look at the overall priorities that I believe this administration is giving the implementation of this act. Fees. The INS regulations today said that fees for each undocumented worker are going to be $185 per worker. Package deal of $420 for a family. $700 if it includes a specific lawyer's fee. That was not the intent of Congress. The legislative history specifically talks about this not being self-financing, that through general revenues and administrative expenses you can have fees on aliens, on undocumented workers. But the legislative history says it should be $50 to $75. Problem one, starving it to death. Problem two, what kind of person are you going to get? Are you going to get the upper income undocumented worker? Or are you going to simply say to the world that here you have this program, and because it's too costly, that gift of coming out of the shadows may be financially impossible? So that's a problem. Sanctions, employer sanctions. Now, how does that work? That works in a different kind of context that I think the push-pull factor has to be addressed. But very simply, it works somehow like this. Hopefully the traditions of this country won't mean that this is how it'll work, but it's as simple as this. You're an employer, and you want to hire somebody for a specific job. The foreign-looking person and the Robert Redford look-alike have the same qualifications, the same documents. But maybe aren't you, just to be perfectly safe, 100% safe, now that you've heard that this law is there, might you not give that Redford-looking guy the first shot? In the same vein, you're talking about specific anti-discrimination provisions put in the immigration law and sanctions. The Barney Frank Amendment, one of your graduates, that specifically says there should be a special counsel within the Justice Department to look at discriminating cases. That counsel has not been appointed. It talked about setting up procedures for having anti-discrimination cases tried within justice. That hasn't happened yet in these regulations. It talked about a number of other provisions that relate to the enactment of setting up a mechanism for complaints of violations. Not sufficiently dealt with penalties faced by employers who dismiss workers unfairly or discrimination in hiring. That's happening right now in Chicago, in Los Angeles, 64 cases in New York of discrimination. How does that work? An undocumented worker, the law hasn't started yet. It starts May 5th. The employer, to be sure, is dismissing people. 100 cases in New York, in Los Angeles, documented by MALDEF. The Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund. Memos of companies ordering to clear out workers who can't immediately furnish documentation. INS running behind schedule. If you're a congressman from the border area, most of the calls are coming about how do we implement this law? What's going to happen? Who's going to start? Who processes my application? Should I get a lawyer? Same from employers. No information out there. No outreach. Attempts being made by INS, but without any kind of success. What are we going to do about ensuring that the average person knows about this law? INS and the Labor Department can come in without any search warrant and go into an employer's records immediately. The employer has 24 hours under these new regs to find all the documents on an individual. Definition of continuous residence is much too restrictive, subverting the intent of Congress. 30 days. In other words, since 1982, you can only have been out of this country for 30 days. Anything more is you don't qualify. No statutory basis for requiring an INS authorization prior to brief absences since the enactment. Known to the government problem, public charge problem, regulations for waiving ground of exclusion, QDEs, qualified demonstration entities, community groups that are going to be involved in processing. No community groups, just umbrella organizations out of Washington and New York. Catholic Conference to help implement this law. Why not across the board? And just give them $15 per application, and that's it. As far as I know, no community organization in the outreaches out in the country is participating yet. What do we do, once again, about the employer issue? How do we ensure that we have businesses not proceed with hiring or singling out individuals who appear to be Hispanic to confirm legal residence or avoid hiring Hispanic-looking people? The EEOC recently put out guidelines, which I think are important, but once again, will they be enforced? From now on, the EEOC says we have to make sure that we continue to proceed to hire not those that are foreign-looking. The Commission listed several other practices that either immigration or civil rights law would deem illegal. The refusal to hire an individual because of an accent, speak English only rules, English fluency requirements that they are not applied equally to all applicants when they are shown not to be job-related, citizenship only requirements, legalization. I've gone through some of those concerns. Documentary requirements being too onerous. No funds, once again, for advertising, outreach, and training. The guest worker provision, a slight problem, dealing with perishable commodities. The definition of perishable commodities under the INS regulation basically excludes most of the United Farm Workers Union, especially in the sugarcane field. And this is not allegations that I am making that are not documented. I am talking about letters that have come from Senator Simpson's co-writer of this bill, Peter Rodino, Romano Mazzoli. I'm talking about guest worker provisions that deal with Congressman Howard Berman, many others that participated in the drafting of this bill. What about political refugees? Thank God for the Supreme Court that ruled several days ago that in the definition of El Salvadorans and mostly Central Americans, we're going to change the definition of political refugees. And that basically means that a political refugee has just have to establish fear of persecution rather than probability of persecution. That means 11,000 more potential men and women from Central America that are fleeing that have a right to participate in this program too. But there's a slight problem. That's 11,000 more processing of applications. Somebody's got to do that work. 2% were admitted under the old system of Salvadorans. Now the increase will probably be dramatic. So what do we do? How's my time?
How's your time? You're getting very close.
All right. What do we do? I've been railing. I've been criticizing. What do we do? One, and I hope Senator Simpson and others consider this seriously because of the concerns that I'm hearing. We need some technical amendments in the law to clean up the regulations that are just being imposed on us. One more legislative process. But we went ahead and trusted the bureaucracy and it's not working. And there are a lot of people out there that feel the INS and the Justice Department are not following the intent of the law and that this program, unless they change, is not going to work. Secondly, we need this new relationship with Mexico. We can't just abandon that. I have a bill that passed the House in the immigration law that talks about a new economic relationship with Mexico, a free trade zone, both sides of the border, products moving duty-free, co-production zone, maquiladoras, twin plants on both sides. An idea. Will it work? I don't know. But we've got to try something. We've got to deal with debt relief when we discuss Mexico. We can't just deal with the irritants, drugs, corruption, and Central America. The President, whenever he talks to the President of Mexico, it's not about immigration, it's not about economic development. It's why do you keep doing that policy in Central America? Why are you not with us on helping the Contras? There are other issues that we need to deal with on the bilateral agenda, because Mexico is a major power and we have to deal with it, not just in one-hour summits at the border, but in extensive consultations at the highest level. What else can we do with this Immigration Act? We can talk about a continuing process of improving the administrative efficiency of the INS. And yes, I've ragged on them. Yes, I've criticized them. But they can't do much without the resources that are needed to patrol this program. Cuban political prisoners, another amendment that I had that needs clarification, that basically talks about political persecution on the right as well as the left. Fidel Castro is just as much a human rights violator as the tyrants that we're supporting in Central America and South America right now. Let's give those Cuban Americans, or those Cubans, the same status as we're doing with this Supreme Court ruling. Let's also deal with a number of initiatives in the Central America area. And I know this may be a little diverted, but if we have a policy that supports democracy in Central America, that supports governments that stimulate economic development of their own people, I think we'll have an opportunity to make a difference, rather than keep creating these persecuted individuals that for political and economic reasons are coming to our country. We also need to talk about ensuring that we have English proficiency. We can't talk about continuing to have a process of education equal to everybody without recognizing that many of these undocumented workers need English proficiency. And I'm for giving them that, but let's do it in an orderly and fair way. Once again, many times I railed against this bill, voted for it many, many times. The last time, recognizing that this was our only shot, that we might lose legalization if we persisted in blocking the bill, I joined Alan Simpson and others in crafting what I think was a compromise with problems, but one that I think would stick. I have my doubts now, and I ask for your help and my colleague to ensure that the law that bears his name will be in the best traditions of our country.
I'm just going to address one question to each of you, and then if you each want to respond. Senator Simpson, I imagine there are a lot of questions in the audience around the big issues on discrimination and U.S.-Mexican relations. I was wondering if I could raise with you one issue that Congressman Richardson raised regarding implementation of the legislation, particularly given the kinds of concerns that have been raised, and given the fact that you sit on the subcommittee. What ongoing responsibility do you think Congress has to ensure that the intent of Congress with regard to this legislation, and particularly in terms of the things that Senator Richardson raised, particularly in terms of the legalization and the anti-discrimination provisions, what ongoing responsibility do you think Congress has and should play in terms of monitoring the executive branch implementation of the legislation?
Well, I think anyone could be aware that Peter Rodino is still the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. Ron Mazzoli is still the chairman of the subcommittee. We have Joe Biden as chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, and Ted Kennedy is chairman of the subcommittee on immigration. It will be done. It will be done fairly, responsibly. I must say that I was a little distressed at some of the things that Bill was saying. It was almost a doomsday scenario, and that's not what's happening. I have been in Washington 8 years. Many of you who follow our government have been here and following it for decades. I don't know of any agency in the United States government that ever gave the public its draft regulations and said, here, take a look at them and see whether they're fair or right. And that's what the INS did. Handed the draft regulations to every editorial board in the United States, to every agency in the United States, every voluntary agency, and they all participated and they all played the game. And then waited until February 5th to say, now we're going to go back to the drawing board, and then came out on March 16th, today, with the formal regulations, which now have a 30-day comment period. You tell me if you ever remember anything like that in your government experience. There is no thing like that. And it is distressing to, and I respectfully disagree, but I have reviewed the regulations. It is not 30 days, it is 45 days. And that is an accumulative aggregate of 180 days, and that is what we're saying there. And this is, we're talking about legalization, and it talks about continuous residence. Well, for heaven's sakes, you've got to have some kind of realistic continuous residence, or else you're just dealing with people who go back and forth. So the number of days that the alien may have been absent without breaking, quote, continuous residence, unquote, which is necessary to qualify for legalization, is now 45 days under these regs, with a 180-day aggregate. There aren't even U.S. citizens that leave the country 45 days. So, I mean, let's keep our eye on the rabbit. The legalization fee, I think that's the one that kind of got to me. It's going to cost $185 to receive the most extraordinary act of grace that has ever been given by any country on the face of the earth. $185 for people who paid $2,000 to some nut to smuggle them in here. And there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of those people. And we're going to charge them $185,000, and they're here illegally. Any other country on earth doing that lately? As we went through that this administration, and let me tell you, this administration hadn't been much help to me in this process. William French Smith was a marvelous ally, and he left. Ed Meese, president. Now, that's all. I had guys cutting my bicycle tire every day in this administration and saying that they were all for it. They weren't for it because a lot of them were from California. There aren't many people there that are ready to help with that. But I just, and the hours, it's not 24 hours before you get identification, it's 72 hours for people who paid $2,000 to some nut to smuggle them in here. And there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of those people. And we're going to charge them $185,000, and they're here illegally. Any other country on earth doing that lately? Not much. Keep in mind, we're talking about people who knowingly came here illegally in violation of our laws. And we're going to give them legalization, and we're going to charge them $185, which happens, ironically, to be just what we charge legal people into the United States. Is there any reason why we should not charge illegals what we charge legals to come in and be part of our nation and be protected by our laws? I don't see it. And another thing, we're not going to get all the money from there, but figure it out. If 4 million come through that process at $185 per person, that's a rather remarkable budget. The budget of the INS in '88 will be $1 billion, either through these fees or through the budget of the Congress, because we've already given them the numbers to beef up the border. So I heard that argument as we went through that this administration, and let me tell you, this administration hadn't been much help to me in this process. William French Smith was a marvelous ally, and he left. Ed Meese, president. Now, that's all. I had guys cutting my bicycle tire every day in this administration and saying that they were all for it. They weren't for it because a lot of them were from California. There aren't many people there that are ready to help with that. But I just, and the hours, it's not 24 hours before you get identification, it's 72 hours Those things make a difference, and Bill is not that way. And I don't want to be a dink, but I just can't let that stuff go by. And that's my problem the whole time of wandering around in this mire. We're going to have oversight, you bet. We put 3 things in the bill to prevent discrimination. Try this one. Do you ever hear of discrimination based on alienage? Well, I mean, this is how esoteric you can get in this game. It means this gentleman is a U.S. citizen and this is a green card carrier from Canada. And it means then that in this bill, if I hire the U.S. citizen just because I like to hire U.S. citizens, this person can bring a charge against me. I've discriminated him against on the basis of his alienage. Try that one on your friends back at the old homestead. Doesn't have a thing to do with race, religion, color, or national origin. Now that's in this bill. But you're able to hire a U.S. citizen over a green card person if they're equally qualified. That's in this bill, too. But I mean, I don't know how far you can stretch it. That was an issue that never even came up. In every civil rights bill, I did all the research I could find and never found anything about discrimination based on alienage. It was called a magnificent shunt to just bring up another issue. You know, if you don't like the bill, invent a new reason. And I'm not talking about Bill Richardson. He scrapped and fought and stuck with it. 5 members of that Hispanic caucus voted for this bill. That's a pretty gutsy act. And they're not going to see it go down the pipe any more than I am.
Keep it short.
Well, Ellen, I obviously got you a little hot. Let me just state for the record, I am sticking with my figures that are based on the draft regulations of 30. I am sticking to my figures of the 1 day. The draft regulations were issued this afternoon. Now,
these are the final, Bill.
The final ones today.
Right. And in there, it says 45 days and 180 days, and it says 72 hours instead of 24 hours.
The draft that you saw, Alan, and the final that I saw are different. You will admit that my figures are correct for the draft.
I will indeed.
All right.
I will indeed.
All right. Well, that'll be settled tomorrow. My main point is this.
Got settled today.
Well, settled today or tomorrow. My main point is that I believe you're in a very difficult spot. You, in my judgment, in the implementation of this law have been abandoned by the White House and by the Justice Department. And the concern that I have is that you have said, well, the regulations was a generous act. I think it's up to the INS to consult with the people of this country about what kind of regulations they're going to have that affect millions and millions of people. Now, they have come forth with draft regulations. Yes, there's 30 days. I have not seen much of a change between the draft regulations issued in February and now. We now have draft regulations, and they are going to be commented for 30 days. We have May 5th, when we have over 100 centers opening up, where we have close to 3.9 million people probably proceeding, 16,000 a day, and I don't think enough information's out. I don't think we have the resources to handle this. I don't think the people of this country know enough facts about it, and I will once again, Alan, say to you that the draft regs that deal with immigration, economic sanctions, that deal with legalization, and that would deal with guest worker provisions are not consistent with the law as you and I and others participated in. And I will stand behind that, and that's what gives me concern.
Well, that's very troubling because Chuck Schumer, a Democrat from Brooklyn, who worked awfully hard on this, said that the regulations were firm, fair, but tough. Now, that was his review of it. The guest worker issue is a tough one. Almost impossible to satisfy the perishable crop people in California. I tried. I failed every time. But I can tell you that the draft regulations have been out. There have been public hearings all over the United States. and they have been held by the INS. The voluntary agencies of the United States, the Catholics, the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, are all out telling the story. We've got to get people to come forward. They have a year to come forward. A year to come forward for this extraordinary act of grace. You know, they're going to find out. And then remember that the voluntary agencies are going to be paid your money to go help them. A certain amount per person will be paid to voluntary agencies.
One question to Congressman Richardson. Many of the opponents of legalization suggested that legalization was rewarding quote-unquote lawbreakers, and many of those who supported legalization argue that society itself, not just the applicants, eligible applicants, benefits from bringing these people out of the shadows. Would you like to comment on that?
Legalization, when many of us had a chance to vote on it, in my judgment, was one of the few positive, constructive things in the bill, although an honest attempt was made at many others. Here we had an opportunity to bring 4 million people out of the shadows who had been working, participating constructively in this society, and I think it was our obligation as a nation of immigrants to give them that, not instant citizenship, not amnesty, but a process by which they would move from temporary resident to permanent residence into a citizenship within a period of 5 years. The hook to proceed with legalization was to have at the same time sanctions, so that those coming in would not be given that same privilege. That was the hook. If you're going to have legalization, you have sanctions. So in my judgment, what we have here is necessary cross-currents that are very risky. But I do think that the intent of the law on the legalization was that it would not be restrictive, that it would be generous, that would enable those that are living in the shadows to come out in a legal fashion, but at the same time recognize that those that arrived after January 1, 82 had a problem. That was the trade-off. So I believe it's our obligation to enforce the spirit and intent of that trade-off. And where I see the differences now is that ensuring that that trade-off is proceeded to in the best fashion, that the regulations implementing this law are much too restrictive, are much too onerous, they don't have the resources to comply them with, and that we've got some serious problems mounting, and that we've better deal with them, probably once again legislatively, than just leaving them to a process that we later can't control. On the whole, however, you're going to ask me, if you're complaining so much, are you better off with this bill than without it? We're better off with the bill, but with careful oversight by the Congress, and not let the bureaucracy of a Justice Department that, in my judgment, Alan, and this is once again not you, is not sensitive to civil rights.
I'd like to open it up for audience questions now. So there are 2 microphones on either side of the room, and if you want to ask a question, can you go to one of those microphones? Stand by the microphone. You should start lining up there if you're interested in questions, okay? Go ahead.
Senator Simpson, I'd like to ask you, don't you feel that the bill bearing your name is somewhat like President Reagan's arms for hostages policy? As to say, if just as selling arms to the Iranians encouraged them to take more hostages, do you think that legalizing these illegal aliens will just encourage more people to come into the United States, hoping that Congress will pass another bill, say 6 years down the road, favorable to them?
I don't know how you draw that parallel. That's puzzling to me. I don't see what you're talking about, the Iranian arms issue in this bill.
In the sense that when somebody's done something wrong, in the hope of
just keep
redressing the situation,
Keep your question short, okay?
You grant them what they did was, not wrong, and attempt to appease them.
Well, I think, I hope I hear that correctly. You're talking about legalization and legalizing people who are here illegally, and that's wrong?
Yes.
Okay. Let me tell you.
Being unfair to others who waited in line from other countries.
Okay. And you are right on target. He's talking about the backlog in legal immigration. People who've been waiting in line for 10, 15, 20 years because their countries are over the limit and they're backlogged. And then suddenly we leapfrog these millions of people in, and that's what I hear you saying. Let me tell you something, and Bill remembers, the debate on legalization in the U.S. House of Representatives, legalization passed by only 7 votes. It is not popular. People don't like it, and yet if it had failed, you wouldn't see a bill. It wouldn't have my name on it. I wouldn't have done it. And I got a lot of hell for that. Because people would say, do you mean, Simpson, that you would legalize people who are here illegally while millions are standing in line to get in legally? And I said, yes, I would, under these conditions, to remove from our society a fearful subculture of human beings who are afraid to go to the cops, afraid to go to a hospital, unless it's for a birth. Then you're giving birth to a U.S. citizen. It's very important you go to a U.S. hospital. And afraid to go to their employer who says, one peep out of you and I'll bounce you down the road. So the alternative to legalization was one that I didn't care to even think about. And the alternative is, if you couldn't find them coming in, how do you find them to get them out? And you do that by going on the hunt. And I'll skip that one, thank you. They can take my name off the bill if they go on the hunt. That's your alternative to legalization. There is no other alternative except setting the date. You can argue about that. But there is no alternative. I wish there were. There is none.
This is a question for Senator Simpson. After listening to you tonight, it really seems that your justification for feeling that these people should be glad to receive this benefit of legalization, and the justification for this type of program is that, in your words, those persons, those people are illegal. In 1850, it was illegal to prevent a white man from killing or otherwise injuring his slaves. Well, Abraham Lincoln didn't feel that those types of laws were justified, and that the acts were justified because the law said they were. So I'm wondering whether or not you might tell us why, just because these people have been declared illegal by a predominantly white society in this country, that fact alone, and nothing more really, because it's unproven that illegals, or undocumented aliens properly, are a net detriment to this society. Why the fact that they alone are illegal is reason enough for undertaking racist or policies that will ultimately produce racist actions.
Thank you.
Well, I like your spirit. That's the way you should be at this age. I didn't declare them illegal. They are illegal. They are people here in the United States without documentation. They have no right to be in the United States because they do not have documentation. That's the way it is.
I don't think Lincoln would have been satisfied with
May
that.
I finish? Then you can fire away again.
Actually, you can't. One question per person.
And, to bring Abe Lincoln into the debate, is an interesting diversion, too. What do you think we have without a bill? When we have 1,800,000 people crossing the border every year, and we think we apprehend 1 out of 2, and they just come into America and they don't have a single right that you and I have. Is that good for this country? I would challenge that, sir, with you. And that's what you had. If anybody thinks the status quo, I love to hear the arguments about discrimination. What the hell do you think was happening in America before the bill? Discrimination is what we call it. People come up to me and say, how about the migrant workers of America? What about them, Simpson, you poop? How about the migrant U.S. citizens, the people who are citizens and permanent resident aliens that can't? How about them? I said, my friend, with 1,800,000 coming across the border every year and apprehending 1 out of 2, there won't be enough migrant U.S. workers to wad into a mortar tube in 5 years. They won't be there. So remember what we're talking about. If you like the status quo, and you like to have an indigestible group of human beings who have no basis in our country under the law, we did fight a war about that. I agree with Lincoln. Yeah, I sure do.
Congressman, would you like to respond to that question as well?
Just very briefly, because I think, in fairness to Alan, there are a number of people, overwhelming poll numbers, for instance, in my state and others, that did not want legalization, that felt that we were rewarding unjustly, that if we had the resources, we should devote those resources to round them up and throw them out. There are many in this country that feel that way. Alan Simpson was not. He stood and fought for this twin concept, and if his answer generated some thought that he was not concerned about a just legalization, I reject that, because I worked with him in public and private forums. And I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, my friend.
Next question?
Oh,
I'm sorry.
I have just a brief two-part question. In 1970, then Governor Ronald Reagan signed a bill in California, the first employer sanctions bill in this country. He promised tough enforcement. 17 years later, not a single employer has been prosecuted under this bill. What makes you think it'll work better on the federal level? And second, up until the 1820s, this country, for all intents and purposes, had no immigration laws. If you were free of disease,
I think that's one question. We're going to have to let me have him answer the first question. I want to make sure a lot of people get a chance to ask. Go ahead.
Employer sanctions with fewer penalties or no penalties don't work anywhere. Michigan had an employer sanctions law, and it was $200. That's just the cost of doing business. Nobody cares about that. This bill has teeth. You can get fined $200 to $1,000 per illegal on the first offense, $2,000 to $5,000 the second offense. This is per illegal. $5,000 to $10,000 per illegal on the third offense, and into the clink on the fourth. Overseas, in France and Germany, there was a study that employer sanctions didn't work, and they don't work if there are no penalties, no teeth. This bill has teeth. The reason that you speak of California, let me tell you why it didn't work anywhere in the United States. Because the law of the United States, till we finished on November 6th, was that it was legal to hire an illegal, but it was illegal for the illegal to work. Now, try that one. I hope you're hearing that. The law of the United States, it was called the Texas Proviso, said that the word harbor did not include employment. It was illegal to harbor an illegal, but the word harbor did not include employment. Well, for heaven's sakes. Meaning then it was legal to hire an illegal and illegal for the illegal to work. And then you ask me why no law worked? That's a pretty good reason right there.
State law, Senator.
I don't care where it is. Talking about the United States. The Fair Labor Standards bills won't work. Farm labor bills won't work because we have the Texas Proviso on the national books.
Next question.
I have a question for Senator Simpson, but also I would welcome Congressman Richardson if he feels to respond to it. Simpson-Rodino law states that if employer sanctions are subject to repeal within 3 years if the government accounting office finds them, 1, that they don't work, 2, that they cause undue regulatory burden on business, and 3, lead to employment discrimination, i.e. employment discrimination against anybody who looks or sounds foreign, specifically Latinos. Now, if within the next 3 years GAO concludes that employer sanctions work, but that they do lead to employment discrimination, would you support the termination, the repeal of employer sanctions? In other words, are substantial economic and social consequences due to employment discrimination a price you feel we have to bear to, open quote, gain control of our borders, close quote?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm the one that co-sponsored the amendment, so why wouldn't I vote for it? I'm the guy. It was a Kennedy amendment, which I embraced in the floor debate. And it said that if it is found by the GAO that employer sanctions are the sole basis of discrimination in the United States, that then an expedited procedure will start up, and it was very clear what's in the expedited procedure: so many days, can't lock it up, no filibusters, and in those circumstances, of course, I would vote to repeal it. But you have to remember, we have the GAO in this game. They're going to make reports. They're going to make an annual report. On the third annual report, if they discover a, quote, widespread pattern of discrimination, unquote, arising solely because of employer sanctions, then we will terminate them. And I will vote to do that by joint resolution and expedited procedures. We do have the EEOC in this game, and we do have the Civil Rights Commission, and I can understand what Bill is saying. He thinks this administration does not have that commitment. I think that that has been distorted somewhat, but let's leave it at that. Don't throw anything. We have a new civil rights office in the Department of Justice. We don't have a person, and they're trying to find a Hispanic for that job. I'm urging them to find a Hispanic for the special counsel. I think that would be not tokenism. A hell of a lot of fine attorneys of every characterization. But that, I think, would be helpful in this situation. And that's what we're doing. And they're going to prosecute individual cases of discrimination based on national origin or citizenship status, and that's in the bill. And so I don't know what more to be said, but the hearing record is very clear as to what we were doing, and the debate record is very clear as to what we were doing. And remember, though, we hope everybody will come forward in the year, because if we extend that legalization, then we'll never get it done, because people say, well, I'll wait till the next go around. So if employer sanctions get knocked off 3 years down the road, there will never be another legalization. And I don't think we want to have one anyway, but you can assure that there will never be one if you get rid of employer sanctions 3 years from now.
Congressman, would you like to comment on that, on the issue of discrimination?
Yes. We had a better provision in the House. It was called the Garcia Richardson provision that simply said if the GAO finds after 3 years, you have a sunset. You eliminate employer sanctions. Now, that didn't make it through the conference because the key that is in the Senate provision is the joint resolution of the Congress. The Congress has to act. I would have liked to have seen the determination made by the GAO and that we accept it. But we will monitor it. It's going to take a lot of oversight. I'm pleased with Alan's statement. But that is key. If in 3 years it looks like we're discriminating, it's not efficient, there's too much paperwork on businessmen, small businesses are spending more time with this than they are in being productive, let's get rid of it, but let's give it that honest shot.
See, what Bill is saying is true. We dealt with both sides of the issue. We are also going to protect the employer in this process and sunset if it's an unreasonable burden upon them. So it's you're right, Bill. I think that's important.
Hi, this is for both Senator Simpson and Congressman Richardson. I had the good pleasure of working with both of them when the bill was going through. And Senator Simpson, thanks for keeping your jokes clean tonight. It was
my mother may be.
One thing that, and to coin a phrase that you had, Senator, it kind of stuck in my craw when this bill was going through. I worked for Senator Paul Simon. We worked pretty closely with him on the Senate side. Was what happens to someone who comes here after 1982, gets a job before November 6th, 1986, and is in an employment situation? Technically, he's okay.
Try to make this a question as best you can.
This is it. This is the question. Technically, he's okay, and he's safe as long as he holds that job. What happens to him though if for example, the employer fires him, or even worse, the employer says, you're going to stay here in this country, conditional on your employment, and as soon as you leave your employment with me, you're subject to deportation. It's kind of a technical problem that ends up happening, but I think there are going to be a lot of people stuck in that gap, whereby they'll be deported if they leave their current employer as of November 6th.
There you are, Mark. I remember that young man. He's a very able person, and he worked for Senator Simon. I do indeed recall that. There are going to be people who are going to slip through the cracks, and that's what oversight is about. The question is not just whether that person that you name would be in some kind of servitude, like, you either stay in there or we're going to get rid of you. But even more appropriate, there are going to be a group of aliens who have come after 82 and before this date, who may have U.S. citizen children on top of that. And this group is going to be treated like any other alien in the U.S. They will apply, if eligible, to be immigrants under our legal immigration system. If they do not qualify and are apprehended, they will be subject to deportation. But look at our deportation history. We do not deport anything in great numbers of human beings. And these are, 4,000. When we're talking about millions and millions of people. And if there is no enforcement, and that the INS has already said there will be no enforcement targeted at this particular group. We're not after that particular group, but we expect them in certain situations to return home if they are not eligible to work in the United States. And they're in the same situation in regard to their situation as they were before the bill, in essence. But we have oversight to do.
I'll yield my response to the next question.
I think the next question's up there.
I would just like to hear someone address the population problem and whether it hasn't been a large part of the difficulties, economic difficulties in Mexico, Central America, and elsewhere in the world. And are we just importing that problem, or can we address it in some way in these countries and in ours?
Well, you're absolutely right. One of the points that I think we're trying to make is that we have not dealt in this legislation with the factor of economic ties and revitalization and development of countries in Central America and Mexico and Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala that are the main source of much of this population. I think we need to develop some constructive economic development plans with them. We have to reschedule debts in the area. We have to find ways, once again, with Mexico to deal with each other. But let me stress to you, since we're talking about perhaps the main coagulant here, Mexico has to do its share too, and they've got to come forth with some political leadership that recognizes that it's not just in their interest and humanity's interest for them to export those that they cannot give jobs to the United States without dealing economically with their problems in their own countries. It's got to be a cooperative effort. And so far, once again, with our consuming interests with the Middle East, with the Soviet Union, the reverse ratio of interest along our borders always diminishes when we talk about other national security issues outside of the hemisphere, and I think this is wrong.
Hello, my name is Donna Guerrero, and I'm from California, and I'm a Hispanic. I'm going to waive my question just to make a couple of comments. One of the things that Senator Simpson said...
Can you try to put it in a question, because that's the format we have. If it's not a question...
It will be brief, I promise.
Okay.
One of the things that Senator Simpson said is that we're going to charge $185 to give legalization to individuals, and that's what we charge present citizens today. This is going to be a difficulty, for one thing, because many Hispanics come from very large families. I would like to know what, you don't have to answer this, but there's 9 people in my family. We happen to get here a little bit early. Say we all needed citizenship today, what would that cost? Another thing that was said is that not many U.S. citizens leave the country for 30 days. There aren't too many...
I hate to do this to you, and I understand you
I'll wrap it up here.
Points. No, it's not so much wrapping it up as try to ask it as to ask a question, and if it's not a question, then
Thank you. There aren't too many U.S. citizens that need to leave the state to go to Mexico because their mother is dying and that need to leave for more than 30 days. The only thing that I really want to say is that Senator Simpson also said that he failed to please legislators from California, for one. The word fail, to me, tends to suggest a putting behind of responsibility. I would feel very poorly that someone who has struggled to pass, has worked for 8 years to get this legislation passed before us today, as Senator Simpson had, would have the type of attitude to say that he has failed. And I hope that he still has the burning desire to achieve more than what has already been done.
Okay, I'm going to yield. Can I just let this lady ask the last question?
Yeah, but I'd like to respond to that. I met this young lady at dinner, and she's a delightful lady, and I hate to see that distortion. I didn't say we'd failed California. I said there was no way I could have satisfied the perishable crop industry in California. Now, that's what I said. And we're not talking about the cost of citizenship. That comes later. We're talking about the cost of a status which lasts 18 months, and then you go to permanent resident alien, and then you go to citizenship. That's what we're talking about. And the cost for an entire family is $420 under this new regulation which was proposed today.
Senator Simpson and Representative Richardson, you've both discussed the possibility that the new legislation will lead to employer discrimination against so-called foreign-looking people who do have work authorization. It's been my understanding, though, that employers tend to prefer foreign-looking people because they tend to work harder, to accept lower wages, to be a bit more compliant, and not to be unionized. I'm wondering, with those incentives in mind, wouldn't employers continue to prefer foreign-looking people, especially given the good faith defense that you have included in the bill?
Who are you? Let me tell you, you hit her right on the head. You did beautifully. They're not going to discriminate. They never have yet, because they're just the kind of people you describe.
Well, I will respectfully, overwhelmingly disagree, because I think you've got a situation where unless there are clear guidelines, the smaller the business, the less compliant they're going to be, unless there's some kind of mechanism, bureaucratic, regrettably, and so that the immigrant and the perhaps foreign-looking person has recourse, you're going to have discrimination. So that characterization that you've made, I just don't buy it.
Well, but she's right, Bill, in the sense of, they're talking about hard work, compliance. This is what they have been in as illegals, and whether we like it or not, that is the way it is. And that's where discrimination is in the workplace now, or before the bill, in extraordinary ways.
I think that's our time, but there's a...
Sorry, we have to end tonight's debate.
I'll stick around. You can turn off the lights or whatever you want to do.
Well, I just came from Washington, D.C. I work for the United Farm Workers Union.
Okay, go ahead.
Senator. And myself and Dolores Huerta, who is the first vice president, who I'm sure you're familiar with, Senator, we're just going through all the state agencies that deal with this specific immigration bill, and all of them are telling us the following. They're saying that they're not pushing, the INS is not pushing legalization for farm workers. What they're doing instead is telling all the agencies that they expect a big expansion of the H-2 program because they're not really going to legalize farm workers. So what I'm saying is, why is it that the INS is instead promoting the H-2 program, like the old Bracero program, instead of pushing for legislation? And secondly, the restrictive definition, they're restricting the definition of agricultural workers to be, for example, the sugar cane worker that the brother Bill Richardson talked about. And that is, I wonder why, because the majority are black. And so I think the prejudice and racism that you talked about is still there. And so what I'm asking is, how can you help us to make sure that the INS is not doing this? Because we also talked to the INS, and we got word that they're hiring all the retirees of the INS. Remember the good old boys that I had to deal with when I was 12 years old as a bracero? Instead of the new type of persons that we need to implement these laws, the new enlightened type of people. And what I'm asking you, how can you help us?
I was raised in a county in Park County, Wyoming, which had a huge number of braceros. The program offended me. I represented many of them pro bono and did a lot of it until I couldn't handle it anymore, and that was before any of you have probably ever heard what the word pro bono was. So I know what that issue is, and if this had been a bracero program, I wouldn't have been involved in it. We streamlined the H-2 program. That is an existing program that uses Jamaicans and Hispanics and whites and Anglos and all sorts of people under H-2, which is a legal program, which is a harvesting program. Cane, crops, figs, but nobody uses it because it's so tough to get through the Department of Labor and the Department of Agriculture, so they don't use it. But we streamlined it here so that we hope people will use it. It doesn't have anything to do with the bracero program at all. It is a good H-2 program, and it was passed by the H-2 coalition, which consisted of labor and employers and unions, and it came through, and I think Bill can tell you that was one of the most remarkable things that the Democratic House did. Got it?
Yeah.
Then we gave special agriculture workers number 1 for people who had been here a certain length of time, and have 350,000 of those coming in. Then we have special agriculture workers 2, who simply must have been here for 90 man days within 1 year period, and that's unlimited, together with replenishment workers. And you tell me we're not doing our share?
No, what I'm saying is it's not being done.
We're not in it yet.
They're adding more restrictive. In other words, it was 90 days and then automatically. Now it's 1 year or 2 years. It's 1 year you become temporary, 2 years become permanent. So what I'm saying is that they're doing more restrictive, and what we need is your help to make sure you can go and deal with those regs.
I got a deal for you. You read the regs that came out this afternoon.
I did. Dolores called me before I came here. That's why I got the
then
notes.
when you do, and tell me what you don't like, write me, and I'll sit down with you, and we'll see what we can do.
Right.
But Congressman Richard, did you want to respond?
I'll yield to anyone who has a last question.
Senator Simpson, this is a question from a Mexican.
Always the worst one. Okay, go ahead.
From Mexican. It seems to me that, well, at least that's how I understood it, that you said that the immigration problem is just a sovereignty problem of the U.S., and therefore this law is something that just matters to you Americans. I believe as a Mexican that we are neighbors and that we have mutually, we have a very large set of commerce relations and other type of relations. We're very close. Each issue you touch here affects Mexico, as well as Mexican issues affect the United States. For me, it's very difficult to understand how can there be an immigration issue that it's only a matter of the United States, and have a drug issue which is mutually of both countries, you know, of concern of both countries. That's the first question. The second question is, I read a long time ago in this study about the immigration from Mexicans to the United States, that the mean Mexican wetback came here for a period of 3 months and then went back and take back some of the money he made here to Mexico. But at the same time, he received a lower wage that was actually approved here, and also was not given any social security or else. It seems to me that these people, which only come to this country to work, because we in our Mexican system have not been able to give these persons jobs or whatever else for certain economical reasons, it seems to me hard to understand that you can put a wall and say, you can starve to death in that other country and not come here. That doesn't sound to me very logic. And on the other hand, as Richard...
You know what, why don't you stop right there? I think he's
Just one more question.
No.
As Mr. Richardson said before, he thinks that the problem can be solved
I give up.
bilaterally and that the Mexican government has to be involved. I believe the same thing. How come you haven't gone into, you're just solving the surface of the problem, not getting to the main part of it?
Mm-hmm.
The reason Mexicans come to the United States is because they can't find jobs in Mexico. Mexico can't provide jobs because it's living a deep economic crisis.
Okay, he's got it. He's got it. He really has it. Go ahead.
Okay. Maybe somebody will applaud for me before the evening is over. Now, wait a minute. Now, that's, again, I'm glad you're here and getting a very bright education. And now let's look at that, and I won't be long. Has the government of Mexico consulted with Guatemala about their southern border?
I'm going to tell you something. I think you said at the beginning of this meeting...
I asked you a question.
That the refugees problem was a different from...
I have asked you a question.
Immigration.
I'm talking about illegal immigration from Guatemala. Wait a minute. He's throwing it off. Let's keep the eye on the rabbit. We're not talking about refugees from Guatemala. I'm talking about illegal, undocumented people from Guatemala. Has the Mexican government spoken with the Guatemalan government about whether they can do this, which they've already done, to control illegal immigration from Guatemala? That's my question. I ask you that. Leave out refugees.
I believe the Mexican government does have meet with the Guatemalan government and have tried to solve the problem. I may say that most Guatemalans in Mexico are refugees more than undocumented workers. And I can tell you for sure that the rate of immigrants coming from Guatemala that are returned back to Guatemala are much less than the rate of immigrants coming to the United States and turned back.
Well, that's why there are now 100,000 Guatemalans in refugee camps in Mexico. But let's go back to the issue of bilateral. I said it as clearly as I could. I've talked to our State Department. I talked with Bernardo Sepulveda. I've talked with De La Madrid and Lopez Portillo. And I said, why doesn't somebody talk about illegal immigration when you sit down to talk about the country's problems between the two countries? And they always say, we will. But they don't, because diplomatically it's poison. So they don't talk about it at all. So the Congress of the United States, consisting of a remarkable group of Republicans and Democrats, hitting the whole spectrum from cowboys from Wyoming to liberals from Massachusetts, passed an immigration bill, which is the first duty of a sovereign nation to do something about illegal immigration. And we did that, and if we don't do it, who will? That is the responsibility of a government, and there isn't a government on earth that doesn't do that, and all of you have been privileged enough to travel. How is it in Austria, in Italy, in Germany, in France, in Brazil? Ask. You have to present papers, and you present them and don't bat an eye. And that's the way it's going to be in the United States of America, and it is the first duty of a sovereign nation to do that, and it doesn't have anything to do with racism. If we were going to do a number on Hispanics, why wouldn't we do it in our legal immigration systems? Hear me. 85% of those who come here under the legal immigration systems are Asian and Hispanic. 85%. So let's kind of keep the guff out of it and try to keep some honesty in the debate. And that's what I've been doing for 8 years. And I will continue to do it in the oversight capacity as we deal again with the remarkable issues of guilt, fear, emotion, and racism.
Congressman?
Looking at the future, if we're going to try to get a handle on this problem, 70% of the problem comes from Mexico. We need to resolve it jointly. But it takes two to tango. I have pointed out the shortcomings of my country in terms of giving Mexico more of a priority. I have pointed out those as a variety of reasons. But I will say to you, and in essence I'm supporting what Alan alluded to, is that Mexico has to tango too. And Mexico is not tangoing. There's a paralysis on this issue, as there is, regrettably, with a lot of issues that affect our bilateral relations. Maybe it's domestic politics. Maybe there are other fish to fry, the debt, massive unemployment within the interior of Mexico. But I think those diplomatic niceties do apply. We have another problem in our bilateral relationship that's cropping up, and this affects mostly border states. Labor unions, many others, are attacking the maquiladora program. You know what that is, the twin plants on the Mexican side, saying that jobs are being taken by from Americans. A little incident. There were some Mexican officials near the hearing where this issue was being debated last week. And I asked them to come and be introduced and maybe say a few words. Not a congressional hearing. And they said to me, we're not going to do it because it's interfering in the internal affairs of the United States. There's something about the policy in Mexico, about their attitude towards resolving problems with us, that is equally the problem. What can you do? You can go back and maybe generate some kind of political movement within your country that will make your government deal more realistically with us as we should with you.
Thank you. I think we have a short announcement. Yes?
First of all, on behalf of the Journal and the caucus, I'd like to extend our thanks to Senator Simpson, Congressman Richardson, and Professor Acker for participating in tonight's debate. We're honored by your participation in the release of the Journal of Hispanic Policy today.